We have the absolute pleasure to learn today from the incomparable Adam Levine, and he's coming up here because he doesn't want me to continue introducing him. Except to say, I said this to you before, but I want to say it again. I really, really feel so grateful to you because in the past few months when I have been covering for Rabbi Graber, I could not do my job without you. And you are always there for this congregation in such a wide variety of ways, not only with your extraordinary Torah reading skills, but with your heart and your soul and your kindness and your teaching, your deep Torah. So we're so grateful to you and grateful to have your parents here, Eric and Terry, in our midst. And without further ado, let's learn some Torah.
Right. You were correct about Shabbat Shalom. 2 years ago next month, Dr. Noam Sienna, who was here as our scholar in residence for Pride Shabbat that year, told us the sad tale of Chava Zlotchever, aka Eve Adams, who came to this country from Poland in 1912. Among her other achievements, she was the founder of a pioneering queer tea room in Greenwich Village, and she published a collection of short stories called Lesbian Love. Her activities attracted the attention of one J. Edgar Hoover. She was arrested for her writings in 1926 and summarily deported back to Europe. She lived in France until she was murdered in Auschwitz. As Faulkner wrote, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." And so I want to dedicate this learning today to her memory and to all of those who find themselves in a similar situation today. So in the Parsha this morning, we read about the first judicial proceeding and the first execution in the Torah. We've heard over the past several parshiot quite a number of actions for which the penalty is described as death. In today's parsha, it actually happens. In brief, it was in the reading that I did, there's a fight between two men. One of them is a full member of the community, and the other is identified as the son of an Israelite mother and an Egyptian father, so a bit of an outsider. In the course of the fight, the outsider curses God's name. The people turn to Moses to find out what to do. Moses turns to God, who commands that the blasphemer die by stoning, and the sentence is carried out. There's a lot to say about this, the story itself. I want to really focus on how it features quite prominently in the complicated rabbinic discourse about capital punishment and due process. So that's what we're going to look at. So, as I said, the Torah has a lot of death penalties prescribed, and the Mishnah and the Talmud talk a great deal about trials and executions. Which crimes deserve which of the four possible punishments, death penalties that the court can impose: skila, streifa, hereg, v'chenek, stoning, burning, beheading, and strangling. They lay out the procedures for each one, and so on and so forth. Now, historically, and you'll have to turn to Eric and Jack on the history here, it's not at all clear whether rabbinic courts ever had enough political clout to actually conduct executions. These texts in the Talmud and the Mishnah do talk like they're talking about something real, or at least something that was done once upon a time, and which stopped at some specific time. In fact, they claim that that executions ceased 40 years prior to the destruction of the temple. So about 30 CE. And regardless of the historicity of this, there's definitely a pro-capital punishment voice throughout this. My teacher, Rabbi Ethan Tucker, with whom I studied Tractate Sanhedrin on Zoom during lockdown 5 years ago, he points out that there is this underlying view that certain offenses create a breach in the world that can only be made whole through the imposition of a death sentence. It's actually, I was thinking of this a few weeks ago during Sophia Avanza's Dvar Torah, in which she told us how the animal sacrifice system kind of fulfills a similar role of sort of making something whole. This is hard for us to swallow, but that is a strain that is present in all of the rabbinic thought about this. However, at the same time, the rabbis managed to completely undermine this, to completely undermine the possibility of executions at all. And the way they do that is through extraordinarily strong due process protections for defendants. So there are all these incredible rules that are laid out. There have to be two witnesses, both for capital crimes and for non-capital crimes. And the court would examine the witnesses, they do the cross-examining themselves, at great length to try to catch them in any lies. And even the slightest incorrect detail would disqualify their testimony. If they get the defendant's eye color wrong, that's considered disqualifying. A guilty verdict would require 13 out of the 23 judges, so a little more than a majority. But one of my favorite things is that if the judges rule unanimously in favor of conviction, the sentence is voided, because there must have been something wrong with the trial if they ruled unanimously. It's actually incredible idea. The execution site is required to be outside the city, far away from the court. And in fact, that's derived in the Parsha today. It says that the site where the guy is stoned to death is chutz lamachaneh, like outside of the camp. And they use that to mean that the execution site has to be outside of the city. And there's a whole procedure in place that even after the verdict is pronounced, the court remains open to new testimony. And even new legal arguments from the defendant. And there's a system in place where there's a messenger on horseback who can interrupt the execution if necessary. They have a full system of flags to tell them to go. And a few of the rules, so these are all things that, seem like a sort of pro-defendant system. But some of the rules go even further. They're a little out there. The witnesses in one of the tellings of this are in fact required to have verbally warned the defendant in the seconds before the crime that this action is illegal. And the defendant is required to have stated explicitly, yes, I understand the penalties and I intend to sin anyway. This may go a little farther than what we see in American criminal law. But taken together, all of these rules indicate actually a very deep skepticism that despite somehow there is some inherent value in a death penalty, human courts are absolutely incapable of carrying them out justly, no matter how deserved the sentences might be. And indeed, the Mishnah reaches the conclusion that a court that executes one person every 7 years is considered to be a bloodthirsty court. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, even if it's only once every 70 years. Okay, so that's the sort of general ideas about the death penalty. I want to zoom in specifically on the case of blasphemy that came up in the Parsha. Some of you may be familiar with the depiction of this that is in one of the finest scholarly works on Jewish life in the late Second Temple period. I am referring, of course, to Monty Python's Life of Brian. How many of you know? You all know the scene, I hope. A man is condemned to die by stoning for blasphemy for uttering the divine name, and in his own defense, he tells us, I had a lovely supper, and I said to my wife, that piece of halibut was good enough for Jehovah. And each time someone says Jehovah, the crowd jumps the gun, and they start throwing rocks, leaving the official, played by John Cleese, to get increasingly annoyed, and warning them not to throw rocks at anyone, even if they do say Jehovah, whereupon they end up stoning the official instead. So now what you may not know is that scene, like many others in the movie, has a direct parallel in the Mishnah, in the 7th parak of Tractate Sanhedrin, 7th chapter of Sanhedrin. Okay, and I want to do a close reading of this amazing text, because it is going to ask the exact same question as the Pythons ask. Okay, Hamagadef, the blasphemer, Eno chayav ad sheyifaresh et Hashem. The blasphemer is only liable if he pronounces the divine name. Same terminology, Yifaresh et Hashem, that we use when we talk about what the Kohen Gadol would do on Yom. Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha says, B'chol yom danin et ha'edim b'chinui yakeh yosei et yosei. Every day of the trial, they question the witnesses using a nickname, a substitute name, yakeh yosei et yosei. Okay, what the heck does this mean? Yosei, or as it is rendered in some translations, Jose, is a 4-letter name that starts with a yud. It's being used as a substitute for the actual name. And in fact, I think it's Rashi, I'm not sure who points this out, the gematria of Yosei is 86, which is the same as, any experts? here. Elohim is 86. So it's a double substitute for the name, right? So they're going to use a substitute name. The witnesses censor themselves, and they don't actually say what the defendant is accused of having said, right? And by the way, to clarify something even further, this wording, yakeh yosei et yosei, means capital punishment does not actually just mean capital blasphemy, doesn't just mean saying the name. It means cursing the name in the name of the name, right? Cursing God in the name of God. Yakeh yosei et yosei, like may yosei smite yosei, right? And in fact, so saying just this piece of halibut is good enough for Jehovah doesn't cut it. It may be prohibited, but it's not capital level blasphemy. And in fact, they derive this from a line in the Parsha today, where this is spelled out in the Gemara, where it says that there's the verse that twice it says "Nokev Shem Adonai," like a person who curses the name of God, and the phrase "curses" is used twice in the same verse. And so they read that like it's not just that you say the name; it's that you curse the name with the name, right? So it's very clever rabbinic reading to put a limitation on. Okay, so that's how they conduct the trial. But the story's not done. Nigmar Hadin, after the trial is concluded with presumably a guilty verdict. Lo horagim b'chinui, they do not execute based on a nickname. Ella motziim kol adam lechutz, they clear the courtroom, they send everyone outside. V'shoalim et hagadol shebahen, and they ask the most senior of the witnesses, v'omrim lo, emor la masher shamata b'ferush, and they say to him, tell us what you actually heard and pronounce it. V'hu omer, and he says it. He says the actual text of what he heard. V'hadayanim omdin al raglehen v'korin v'lo me'achin, and the judges stand on their feet and they tear their clothes and they never sew them back together, right? They tear their clothes and they never sew them again at hearing the actual curse pronounced. The Hasheni Omer, Afani Kamohu, Vashlishi Omer, Afani Kamohu. So then the second witness says, I also heard like he did. And the third witness says, I also heard like he did. So they don't make the second witness and the third witness say the whole thing. They suffice to say that one of them does it. But this is amazing. This is actually totally remarkable. Even after the judges heard enough evidence in the trial to convict, they voted, at least 13 out of the 23 were convinced by the bleeped out testimony, and they voted to convict. This text tells us that that's not enough. At least one witness has to speak the precise words of the curse, cursing the name of God in the name of God in court. After all, how can we know that the censored version isn't what the guy said, right? Maybe that was just what the defendant actually said, and that's not a capital crime. There's only one way to establish guilt for sure, and that is for the witness to testify to the defendant's actual conduct, down to the finest detail. And what's more, even as we saw before, one of the interesting procedures was when Nigmar Hadin is the phrase that's used after the verdict, as that's not actually the end of the trial. As the defendant is being led off to the execution site, the court remains open to new exculpatory evidence. So it's entirely possible that this entire thing, the defendant could go free even after this whole ritual occurred. The whole thing was for naught. And the answer to that is no matter. Even in this rabbinic system, the commitment to due process, even for someone who cursed the name of God, is inviolable, up until the point of actually requiring the witnesses to repeat the crime. So as due process is certainly something that's in the news, and I think most of us are not going to adopt the view that witnesses have to have warned a defendant before they get a speeding ticket. But I think that actually there's a lot for us to learn here about the absolute sacred duty of giving people the chance to have their stories heard and for the to be treated with the full due process of the law. Shabbat shalom.